We are very excited to have here with us Professor Daron Acemoğlu. I do not want to take up all the time of the seminar for introducing him because it's going to take a very long time. If I start going on and on with his prominent work, his awards, and so on. But briefly, he is a professor of economics at MIT, and he has contributed into many different fields in economics in terms of institutions, development, and labor economics. So I'm going to, without much further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Professor Daron Acemoğlu, who is going to present his work on automation, task displacement, and the role of these things in US wage inequality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gözde, and thank you, everybody, for inviting me and for being here. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but I guess this is one of the advantages of Zoom, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to do this in person as well in the near future. So I am going to talk about some recent work I have with Pascual Restrepo on tasks automation and the rise of US wage inequality. It's not quite topical given the tumultuous situation in Turkey right now, but it has the advantage of being sort of fresh off the press type of work. It's very much what Pascual and I have been working on over the last 2 years. And it also builds on a research program that Pascual and I, as well as several others, have been engaged in for almost a decade. So it gives me an opportunity to talk about some new work, but also introduce some ideas that may not be familiar to many people in the audience. But let me motivate it with the question at hand, and then I'll come to the bigger picture as I go. So there has been a huge increase in inequality in many countries. Again, I want to keep this on the sort of the academic thing, so I'm just going to show you the US data, but I could have shown data for a number of other countries which have some parallel trends in the sense that there is a increase in various dimensions of labor market inequality since around the early to mid 1980s. So this is the US pattern, which is distinctive in some ways, but not so distinctive in others. You see for 10 demographic groups, this is distinguished by gender and education, going all the way from less than high school degree to workers with a postgraduate degree, such as MA, MBA, PhD, and so on. And these 10 demographic groups experienced more or less shared prosperity for the 1960s, early 1970s, also 1950s from different data sources, around 2% a year in real terms. But since 1980, we see a very different pattern, much greater inequality with the top continuing to increase, but workers in low education, but also some middle education, such as workers with some college but no college degree. The gray bar here is showing actually quite remarkably real wage declines. There's a large literature on this in economics and beyond. And I have listed here what I think are the most prominent explanations. One that is very popular among economists and more broadly is what is called skill-biased technological change. You can think of the productivity of skilled and unskilled workers being augmented by different terms. So this would be skill-biased technological change, AH. And many people believe that a very important contributor to the changes in inequality has been this fact that technologies that are complementary to high-skilled workers have made big advances. A related one that goes back to the work by Zvi Gerelikas and more recently revived by several economists is sort of a close cousin. It's not sort of technology that is changing so much, but capital deepening. But with the proviso that capital, or at least some types of capital, are more complementary to high-skilled workers than low-skilled workers. Also very important, and labor market institutions have changed. Collective bargaining has become less important. Social norms that protected workers at the bottom of the distribution via rent sharing arrangements have been eroded, and the real value of minimum wages, for example, in the US since 1980 have fallen by about 35%. So that's another important change, and you would definitely have to invoke that if you want to understand some of the cross-country differences. For example, this pattern here that I showed with low skill wages declining is not common across all countries. You see that a little bit in the UK and Germany, but not in Scandinavia or France, for example. Trade, there has been a huge increase in trade, especially from low-wage countries such as China, again, with important implications. So there's some truth to all of these, but what I'm going to argue, what Pasquale and I argue, is that it's actually much more important to focus on what we are going to talk about as automation technologies. And by automation technologies, I'm going to be very specific. What I mean by that is technologies that substitute machines or algorithms for tasks previously performed by humans. So it's the substitution of technology for human labor that's critical, as opposed to the complementarity or the complementary types of technologies emphasizing the skill bias technological change and the capital skill complementarity. By the way, I should have said at the beginning, feel free, please, to jump in and ask questions. There will be 15 minutes at the end to ask questions, but if you have questions for either clarification or that is timely, definitely feel free to jump in. So here is essentially a summary of the paper, or a summary of the empirical finding of the paper. What I'm going to do is develop a new theory of thinking about how automation influences technology. And that's where I'll give you a little bit more background about recent research over the last 10 years or so that we have and others have been doing in this area. On the basis of that, we're going to construct from the data a measure of task displacement experienced by different demographic groups. I'm going to do this not at the level of the 10 demographic groups I showed you, but for 500 demographic groups, distinguishing, for example, Hispanic and Black workers and workers by age, as well as immigrants. And essentially, this is going to be a function of where workers used to specialize in terms of occupations and industries. So it's a measure of their comparative advantage, so to speak, in a way that will again be clear once I present the model and the empirical work. And it will also be a function of whether the industries they are employed in, or they used to be employed in, have suffered or have experienced a lot of automation, and whether especially those automation has affected the occupations in which they specialized. So on the basis of this, we construct this task displacement measure that uses only data information about what these workers were doing in the 1980s. And what you see here is that there is a striking relationship between this task displacement experienced by a demographic group and the real wage changes that they have experienced. So for example, if you take these demographic groups that are for low wage groups, such as high school graduates, white and young, they have experienced a lot of task displacement, and they have also experienced close to 20% decline in their real wages, which is again a really remarkable number. As you can see from this regression here, or the line here, a regression that just looks at the relationship between this cloud of points is going to be a great fit. And in fact, it explains about 50 to 70% of all changes in US wage structure since 1980. So that's essentially a summary of the paper, but of course doesn't mean much because the theory is not clear to you yet, nor is it that transparent how this measure is constructed, but it's sort of a teaser to sort of give a sense of where we're going. Okay, so here is the outline of where we're going. So I'm going to construct a multi-sector model of the allocation of tasks across demographic groups with general comparative advantage across tasks and industries. And I'll explain why this is actually important. It's not, it is building on previous work that Pasquale and I have done, as well as previous work by Yossi Zeira from late 1990s. But this is going to be an alternative model of how to think about production and, of course, of the effects of technology and other changes. Within this framework, I will highlight what the effects of automation that displace workers from tasks that they used to perform will be, and why it's very different from the normal way or the more usual way in which economists think about technology. But most importantly, this framework is going to give us a reduced form equation linking a group's weight changes to direct task displacement. So it's going to give us a theoretical equivalent of this figure. And then it will also give us clues about how this task displacement can be exactly measured in the data. What this figure misses are general equilibrium effects in a way that, again, the theory clarifies. But then the theory also gives us ways in which we can estimate those general equilibrium effects. So all of those will be part of it. So then the bulk of the paper, but probably a little bit less of my presentation, is going to be on reduced form empirical evidence, showing that that figure really does account for a lot of the variation and is greatly robust. And I'll also give you some sense of what some alternative explanations are and how much they're contributing and so on. And then finally, at the very end, I'll outline a new methodology for estimating GE effects within this framework based on what I'm going to call, what Pasquale and I call propagation matrix. And these are going to enable us to have a very succinct, low-dimensional way of estimating GE effects in a way I'm going to explain. All right, that's my introduction. And since time is short, I'm also skipping the related literature, although I gave you sort of the broad outlines at the beginning, and I'll sort of link the theory a little bit to the related literature in a second. Are there any questions at this stage?
There are no questions on the chat screen.
Okay. All right. Okay. So here is the main innovation here, which again, the first person, there were versions of it out there in the literature in the 60s and 70s, but the first person who formalized this was Joseph Zeira, and essentially work I did with David Otter and more recently with Pasquale Restrepo builds and extends that framework. So what is the difference of this framework from the standard one that economists use for thinking about technology? Well, I would say that, and mea culpa here, I have a textbook on economic growth. So everything I'm saying about the standard way that economists use for models for thinking about technology applies to almost everything in that book as well. So essentially, we take technology as sort of like a black box. You put factors of production in, and out comes marginal products and productivity. And that seems to be okay for many purposes. But the problem is, it turns out, that there are lots of details that that framework misses. But in missing them, it also imposes lots of assumptions, at least in its tractable ways. So what I'm going to do first is develop an alternative way of thinking about production in the task space. So rather than think of a black box, let's imagine how you would perform the production of a particular good, say, for example, a piece of garment. So to produce this even simplest piece of garments, like just a shirt, you have some design tasks. You have to design, is it going to have buttons, how big the buttons are, and so on. Then you need to start by spinning to produce some yarn. And then, that yarn needs to be woven. So there are a range of weaving tasks. Actually, it's not a single weaving task. It's a variety of weaving tasks depending on what type of weaving you are doing, for example, for the buttons or for the stitches and so on. Then there's a whole host of chemical processes, dyeing, drying, and other chemical processes to give the garment its particular texture. But the production tasks are not just it. So then you need to do a range of non-production tasks, how you're going to advertise and market this, how you're going to do all the back office tasks necessary, how you're going to ship this, how you're going to wholesale and then retail it. Only when all of these tasks are performed, that piece of shirt can actually be consumed by a final consumer household. So I want to get a little bit closer to that. And I'm going to think for each sector, so let me start with the one sector economy, but I'll go to the multi-sector in a second. For each sector, I'm going to assume that there is a range of tasks that need to be performed. And the task services are denoted by YX, and this script T is the set of tasks. Lambda is the elasticity of substitution across tasks. They don't need to be combined by a constant elasticity, but that's just convenient. And think of lambda as a low number. So in particular, say a number less than 1, so that all of these tasks are essential. You cannot ignore one of the tasks and still do production. The rest of it is just functional form that doesn't really matter. It's just for convenience. The key here is how are these tasks produced? So what I'm assuming is that there is going to be a general comparative advantage structure, but tasks can be produced by different factors of production within that. So for example, you can allocate capital to produce task X. Capital is going to have some factor augmenting general productivity. This is essentially the way that the most common way that neoclassical production functions signify encapsulate technology. That will be AK, so I'm allowing that for contrast. But the more important thing is the orange term here. Psi K of X is the task-specific productivity of capital. Then I have G types of labor. So in my empirical application, I'm going to have 500 types of labor. Each labor has a different productivity in task X. So psi GX is the productivity of type G labor in task X. And again, I'm also allowing this factor augmenting technologies AG. And the summation here with LGX says, again, you can produce this task using a variety of different types of labor. So the simplification here is that I'm ignoring the fact that, of course, when you use labor for some specific task, some of that requires a little bit of capital as well. So I would say that, if you need to do if you need to do nailing, you need a hammer and you need nails. So those are intermediate inputs, or you can call the hammer a capital. I'm ignoring those. Those are small, doesn't really change anything, but this is sort of more transparent in some sense. Okay, so we have G plus 1 factors of production, G types of labor, and capital. So, of course, there are many different ways of closing the model, but I'm going to do the simplest thing possible. First of all, I'm going to assume that capital goods themselves are produced from the final good at the rate Q of X. The reason for that is because if I wanted to specify, I want to allow capital to be task specific, because it's going to be task specific productivity. So if I wanted to allow capital supply, then I would have to have a distribution of capital as a state variable. Could be done, it's not a big deal, but this is easier to do for a variety of things. And then I'm going to fix the supply of labor of all G types. Again, that can be endogenized. We do that in the paper as an appendix because some labor economists are very keen on that, but it doesn't change anything, and I'm going to keep that simple. And then finally, to close the model, you need to have a market structure and equilibrium. So I'm going to do that at competitive equilibrium. Actually, this is some of our ongoing work. These task-based models become really interesting in the presence of labor market imperfections, but this is somewhat distinct from the issues that I want to talk about today. So I'm doing the simplest thing and assume a competitive equilibrium, which in this context also implies that equilibrium maximizes net output. Sort of a simple second welfare theorem result. All right, so let me now give you a more visual way of thinking about these objects, and also introduce one of the most important concepts. So here is a representation figure diagrammatically of a task space with 3 types of labor, 3 types of factors: labor of type G prime and G, and capital. So an equilibrium or an allocation here will be given by these boundaries here that separate this space into 3 sets. They don't need to be convex sets, but I'm just drawing it as, almost convex sets. They could be disconnected because it's a general pattern of comparative advantage. I'm not going to impose any single crossing property throughout, but this is just easy to visualize in this way. And you can see that it's gonna really matter which tasks are allocated or how many tasks are allocated to a factor. So indeed, if that's your intuition, you would be completely right. And to capture that, we're gonna define this object here, which we're gonna call task shares. Gamma G is the task share of factor G. How much of the factors, or what proportion of the factors are allocated to that, what proportion of tasks are allocated to that factor. So it's the integral of psi G to the power lambda minus 1 over the set Tg of tasks performed by factor G. So in the simplest case where lambda is equal to 1, for instance, this is just the measure of this set. If lambda is not equal to 1, then it's a weighted measure, but it's the same thing. Okay. Here is the characterization of equilibrium here. The first line says, once you solve this model, which I'm not going to go through in detail in this talk, of course, output looks like this. Now, if you stare at this, at first this will appear like all I've done is I started from the micro and I built up to something that looks very classical or neoclassical. It's constant elasticity of substitution production function with elasticity lambda, and all that matters for production is AG effective G LG. But actually, looks are deceptive. This has nothing to do with a CES production function. And the reason for that is that in the CES production function, this orange term is missing, or it's a constant, whereas here, all the action is going to come from the orange term. In fact, we'll see that technology that it will always affect orange term or the task shares, and that's where a lot of the action is going to come from. And it will also clarify why I said at the beginning, if you sort of think of the more neoclassical model, especially with this most common parameterization of technology in the form of factor augmenting technologies, you're actually making a lot of assumptions that are both very restrictive and empirically not so well supported. And that's going to be very clear when we do the comparative statics with respect to gamma G versus the AG. Second, in fact, it's not even true that the elasticity of substitution here is lambda. And that's for the same reason. When elasticity of substitution is when we change prices, how much demand changes, or when we change quantities, how much marginal products change. Well, there are a lot of the changes going to happen here. So as a result of that, the actual elasticity of substitution is endogenous, depends on the specific part of the task shares, etc., and the comparative advantage schedules, and is always greater than lambda. It's going to be an endogenous variable, sigma G. What about wages? Well, here is the wage equation. And you'll see it depends on productivity, it depends on factor augmenting technologies, and the task shares. And then a very important concept is going to be the labor share or the capital share, and I'll come back to that again. But obviously, that's going to be whatever is left to labor, so it's going to depend on which tasks are assigned to capital. But now that I have given you the general form, which might be interesting to some people, but for many might still be a bit of a puzzle, so let me try to do a little bit more with it. So now let me think of what automation means in this context and how the previous equations, as well as the diagrammatic exposition I introduced, help us think about it. So automation is going to be change in technology that assigns some tasks previously performed by labor or some type of labor to capital. So in particular, a rise in the productivity of capital in tasks that were previously in task set G. This will most importantly lead to what we're going to call a direct displacement. And we're going to denote that by change in the log of the task share and auto here, because this is due to automation. And it's shown here by the orange term. The effects of technology are not just confined to this direct displacement, because once some tasks are taken away, say from high school graduate men, those workers now have lost their jobs, so they're going to go and compete for other tasks. So those are what we call ripple effects. So for instance, in the US, I'll show you that in the data as well, men who lose their job to automation go and compete and push down the wages of women. Those are the ripple effects. Now, for future reference, I also want to note what the productivity effects of automation are. It's actually very simple. To a first order, it's given by this. This is the share of labor costs, sorry, share of costs that's accounted by demographic group labor type G. This is how much displacement there is, and pi G is the cost savings. Now, this is a point that Pasquale and I have made for the last 10 years in different contexts. What this immediately gives you is that unless these cost savings are very large, productivity increases from automation are going to be small. So for instance, even if you take cost savings to be something like 30%, which is huge, you'll see that in the data, given the amount of displacement, which is large, you're still not going to get much productivity gains. So as a result, again, this is going to play an important role. Automation is going to be a type of technological change that has little productivity gains in general and huge distributional effects because of displacement. Now, let me compare that now to the more standard factor augmenting changes. What happens if you have an increase in AG? Now the productivity of labor increases in all of these orange tasks. That's a huge productivity effect. So now productivity effects is D log AG. That can be very large. In fact, needs to be very large if you want to get much action from AG. But critically, there is no displacement effect. Any change in AG does not directly displace any workers from their tasks. It just makes them more productive. Now, there will still be ripple effects, but there is no direct task displacement. The ripple effects are generally, in a way that I'm going to make it more precise, they're going to be second order in at least some calculations. All right. So now putting all of these into a proposition form, here is the effect of technologies on wages and TFP. Any technology is going to create a productivity effect. It increases output, and that's going to translate into wages. That's the hopeful trickle down. It might have an effect on technology because of factor augmenting changes. Those are going to be small unless the sigma G is very different from 1. In the data, I'll show you, it's going to be around, say, 0.0, 0.08 or 0.8 or 0.7. So it's pretty close to 1. So you're not going to get much here. The direct displacement effect, this is going to be big, even for modest changes. We'll see as very big, plus the ripple effects. TFP, very simple. Ripple effects don't matter for TFP. That's the envelope theorem logic. That's where the competitive markets really help you. This matters a lot. This matters little for realistic values of pi G. So that's the theory, but except that this is a one sector theory, whereas if I want to take it to the data, I have to do multiple sectors. So let's do multiple sectors. I'll go over that very quickly because there's nothing much new here. Now, instead of just one sector, I have many sectors. And the demand side is homothetic. That's for simplicity. It doesn't really matter. So I summarize it by consumption shares as a function of the vector of prices. Each sector potentially has their own task set, although there might be some overlaps between sectors. And then everything else is the same as before. Please, yes, please, yes.
Can I ask a question about this?
Please, of course.
We have here. So I see here, I was going to ask it on the previous slide, but now I see that the labor supply for group G is fixed, right? But I'm thinking of the following. Well, very simply, educational attainment all over the world, more or less, is rising, right? So yes. The demographic groups that are basically exposed to this task displacement are actually shrinking, if I understand your
That's right, correct.
Right. So can we introduce, can we basically introduce a flexible LG to this model, or what will happen to the task shares or the task displacement as the demographic groups shift?
So absolutely, and we do that in the appendix of the paper. So labor supply can be endogenized, and of course you can also have labor supply shocks. In the empirical work, I'll take care of that. And from a theory point of view, that's interesting, although it's a little orthogonal to what I wanted to emphasize, and that's why I have abstracted from it. But you're absolutely right, and in fact, it is a remarkable thing that the relative supply of low education groups is declining, and that's despite that they're having these very large declines in their both real and relative wages. I'll come back to that. Thank you, Gözde. Okay, so this is the model. Nothing's changed. And now the equilibrium is going to be a little bit more complicated because now you have to worry about task shares that are specific for factors and industries, and then prices have to be determined. So these are endogenous in GE. That's part of where the GE is going to come from. But at the end of the day, nothing much changes. So if we want to think of the effects of technology, which is going to be my key estimating equation, it takes this form. So let me go through this. It has the usefulness of reiterating some of the things I just said in the context of the one sector model, but some new elements and some notation as well. First, we have the productivity effect. That was present already. Nothing has changed. Now, productivity effect is more complex because productivity is going to change for a variety of reasons, but the trickle-down logic is always there. Productivity effect is always going to be felt by wages unless other things interfere, like changes in task shares. This is going to be an equation I'm going to estimate, and this productivity effect is actually common across groups. So this is going to be absorbed in the constant. This is where the GE is important. So if you don't do GE, we're not going to know how important the productivity effect is, for instance. So that will have implications about what you may or may not be able to say about, say, real wage level changes. So that's part of the reason why we want to do general equilibrium. But in our regression, at first, this is going to be into the constant term. There are those group-specific technologies. These can take more complex forms than this one here. So here I showed you the simplest one, which is factor augmenting. But actually, you can see that if instead of being completely factor augmenting, if we had a set of inframarginal tasks that are never going to be competed by other groups, and they increase in productivity, that's going to have similar effects as well. So in the paper, in our overall work, this AG is actually more general. It's not just factor augmenting. It includes what we call productivity deepening. And at the end of the day, in the data, we're going to capture these with linear trends by education and gender. This is a new term that did not exist in my previous slide because that was one sector. But with a multi-sector world, there's going to be sectoral shifts. We can think of these as a variety of things. One of them is Baumol effects. As the famous economist William Baumol emphasized, some sectors are not going to have as much capital deepening or productivity growth, such as health, education. That's going to increase their consumption shares. And that has implications for the factors that are used in those sectors. If, educated people such as ourselves are working in the education sector and the education sector's value-added share is expanding, that's good for us. So the model tells us exactly how that should work out. It's this term here, again, up to a first order. It's the omega GI is the cost share of factor G in industry I, and these are the value-added shares of industries. So that's how we're gonna be able to construct this and control for this in the regression. And then finally, this is the direct displacement of group G plus ripple effects. Now, the ripple effects are really complicated. Those are the ones that really depend on the general structure of comparative advantage. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to assume no ripple effects. So for example, if you make an Armington-like assumption that each factor has some tasks at which it's very good at, and no other group is very good at those tasks, that would kill the ripple effects. But then I'll come back to them in the general equilibrium estimation. So now the key here is I've told you this is a constant. this is easy to parameterize. This is easy to compute and put on the right-hand side. How we're going to compute this direct task displacement here. Because now it's not a single sector issue. It's like how much task share reduction you're suffering in different industries. Well, omega GI, I observe in the data, but how do I compute this? Well, theory helps there as well. And it tells us that under some reasonable assumptions, we can approximate it by observables. So here is the assumption I'm going to make. I'm going to identify a set of tasks, which let me call them routine tasks, but in the data we use both a variety of different measures. These are tasks that can be automated. And then all groups performing these automated tasks are going to experience automation in the same way. So what that means is that if Gözde and I are both, accountants, and if accounting tasks are being automated, we're going to get impacted. It's not that Gözde is so much of a better accountant than me that she will survive automation and I'll get displaced. So we're both going to get displaced. That's the assumption. So under those assumptions, task displacement can be measured in this way. Omega GI is the cost share of group G in I, as I said. That's the revealed comparative advantage of a group for an industry. But what matters is not your comparative advantage for an industry, but comparative advantage for routine or automatable tasks in that industry. Erinç and I may be in the same industry, but he's a manager, I'm a line worker, so automation will be good for him or will not be bad for him. So I want to distinguish myself and Erinç in that case. And that's going to be how much I am specializing in routine tasks in that industry. So educated groups often are going to be less at the crosshairs of automation. And then the model also says, for reasons that I already highlighted in the one sector setup, the units via which things are affected is going to be labor share. So it's this labor share decline due to automation. So these I observe in the data from microdata. This I observe in the data. So the final thing is how do I compute this? Well, I'm going to make two assumptions. The first one is like a warm-up. Assume Cobb-Douglas, no change in markups. In the general theory, we also allow for markups as long as they are constant, that's fine. But Cobb-Douglas is very strong here, lambda equals to 1. If that's the case, you can use the actual realized labor shares. Not a great measure, but it's a good warm-up measure. But instead, what we're going to use is take the predicted component of the industry labor shares that are explained by various measures of automation. So in particular, we use the adjusted penetration of robots and measure that Pasquale and I developed in some previous work. And that has the advantage of being sort of exogenous because it uses technological improvements at the frontier of robotics. And then change in specialized software and change in dedicated machinery services and value added. So this is like an IV exercise. Okay. All right. This theory was a little long, but it was necessary. But once, hopefully, we are on the same page with the theory, actually, the rest is not so hard. So I can do the empirical work fairly quickly because it's very intuitive and it's going to follow the theory. And then I'll say a little bit about the GE, but probably not have all that much time for the GE. All right, measurement. So we use lots of different data sources for microdata to measure individual wages. But the important thing, the industry, I'm going to do it at the level of 49 consistent industries from the Bureau of Economic Analysis and then various different things. The routine jobs are going to be from the ONET data set, as my previous work with David Otter has done. About a third of occupations are routine. But this doesn't really matter too much. Different measures of automatable give similar results. All right, so here is one way of warming up to what the data is going to show. So these are the 49 industries on the horizontal axis. The blue line is the actual labor share decline. And the orange line is our measure of automated driven labor share decline. So the predicted value from that regression that I mentioned. A couple of things. First of all, this makes a lot of sense. Mining is the sector that experienced the largest share in the labor share decline. Transport, motor vehicles, this is car manufacturing. But you see that the ranking is not super different if you look at the orange rather than the blue. In fact, the R square of one versus the other is about 50%. So according to this measure, a lot of the changes in labor share across industries is related to automation. And this is robust whether you do bivariate or control for things like markups, trade, and various labor market institution measures at the industry level. Just to give you a sense, this is on the left, the relationship between one of our measures, the one that's most exogenous, the robot penetration. But as you can also see, a lot of industries have zeros for robots. Those are the non-manufacturing industries. These are industrial robots. There's very little use of industrial robots in non-manufacturing. You see there's interesting variation within manufacturing. Apparel, for example, has very low robot penetration. In fact, it has very low automation in general. It will have high trade, but very low automation. But motor vehicles and chemicals have very high automation. And again, you see the negative relationship. Here, I'm looking at software-based measure. Now, well, actually, this is both software-based measure and dedicated machinery. I couldn't fit too many in a slide. So now you see non-manufacturing has a lot of action as well. But motor vehicles, metals are still high automation. Apparel is still low automation. Professional services is fairly low. And this is now our full measure using all three sources of variation. Again, you see apparel there, and restaurants are, restaurants would be very different in 10 years' time, thanks to COVID and various other things. But in our sample period up to 2017, restaurants are very low automation. All right, finally, one final descriptive statistic, or a way of visualizing the data. This is all at the industry level. So now I'm going to use this equation here to construct demographic group level task displacement. And this is my first figure exhibiting that. On the vertical axis, we have the task displacement measure from 1980 to 2016. It's using only information on where you specialized in 1980. The only reason why it's 1980 to 2016 is because the automation measures I'm using here, these orange bars, have information from 1980s onwards. And on the vertical axis, I'm showing the hourly wage in 1980. So you see that it's got a bit of an inverse U shape. It's the middle class occupations that are most affected by task displacement. Something to bear in mind in interpreting results in a second. All right. Now that I have gone through the model and the measurement, I'm showing you the same figure again. I actually forget which one I showed you in the first slide, but this is using the raw labor share decline. This is using the automation-driven labor share decline. They look very similar. And you get the around 60% R square in both cases. So there's a very strong relationship between this measure of task displacement and subsequent real wage changes. One thing you may be worried about is that this is capturing some secular trends. So I'm showing you the same variable on the horizontal axis, but now the vertical axis is the pre-1980 changes. And you see that these groups were, they weren't all experiencing the same real wage gain, but actually the range here is much smaller than before. This is the shared prosperity, and there is no relationship between our task displacement measure and the pre-1980 changes. Okay, this is the summary of the empirical work, really, but I'm going to show it to you in a regression form. Here is the regression. The first column is with the corresponds to this figure. And then the fourth column here uses the automation-driven one, so corresponds to this figure here. Okay. So you see, very, very similar. In both cases, about 65% of all changes in the US wage structure are projecting onto this measure. But of course, theory says you shouldn't just have a bivariate regressionship. Industrial composition matters, and there might be other technological changes, for example, skill bias, capital deepening, and so on. So the second column adds those things. Industry shifters are actually important. So economics, basic economic theory does matter. With our favorite measure, they're actually marginally insignificant. With this one, they are more significant. But the remarkable thing is that not much changes in terms of the effect of, actually, let me do it here. Not much changes in terms of the effect of task displacement. Even more remarkable, college premium and the postgraduate premium, they are not significant. So whether a group has education or postgraduate education is not significant. So all of these skill bias technological change measures, it turns out that they were significant because they were proxying for task displacement. Once you control for task displacement, they go away. Overall, more detailed educational dummies, they explain about 8 to 9% as opposed to 55% or so by task displacement. Now, here task displacement really has two components. It's exploiting a demographic group's industry distribution and that demographic group's distribution across occupations. So in this column, finally, we separate those things out. So we include exposure to industry labor share declines and whether your specialization in routine jobs in general matters. This has very little effect on these coefficients or how much we explain, again, 65 to 70%. But there's a very important implication here. Look at these variables here. These are very close to zero and insignificant. What that says is that if Erinç and I are in the same industry that's undergoing a lot of automation, say cars, but Erinç is a manager, he's not suffering any negative consequences. But if I am from a demographic group that specializes in welding, I get hammered. So that's what this controlling for this says. All right. Okay. I can do much more in terms of unpacking where this result is coming from. For instance, which component of automation, all of them matter. Each one gives very similar results, and when you combine them, you get a little bit more, and over-identification tests pass. This digs in more into automation versus skill bias, technological change, and gender. I already showed you the main idea here that college premium, high school premium, etc. These things almost entirely seem to be related to automation, but gender not. So if you don't control for automation, the gender gap closes by about 17%, 17.5%. If you control for automation, you explain about a third of that, about 7 percentage points of that. So some of the gender gap was due to the fact that men were more negatively affected by automation, but there are autonomous changes in gender, which of course makes a lot of sense. Now, I'm going a little fast, but this is more like a pointer to people who are interested and can read more in the paper. If this is indeed, as I'm claiming, a labor demand shock or labor demand change coming from technology and automation, then it should also affect employment. And in fact, that's exactly what you find. Groups suffering task displacement have seen very significant declines in their employment rates, hours, and participation rates. And again, that's a very robust result. Now, the main thing that you should be worried about, that even the IV strategy doesn't fully deal with, is that, well, automation may be partly endogenous and partly coincidental with other changes. And after all, how do you know this is really automation and not other technological changes? But here again, theory is very useful because it gives us exactly how all of these other changes should also impact things through these exposure measures. So I'm going to go through two tables that show that. First, in this table, what I do is I try to show you that really there's something distinctive about automation relative to other technologies. So here I control for exposure, again, using your reveal comparative advantage or cost shares, to changes in the capital output ratio of industries. This has no effect on the task displacement measure. Its coefficient remains around -1.4 again as before. And exposure to capital deepening has zero effect. And here we look at other types of technologies. Remember, if my theory is correct, these factor augmenting technologies will matter a lot for TFP, but won't have huge distributional consequences because they're not creating much displacement. And that's exactly what you find. TFP, industry TFP, again, your exposure to it doesn't change this, remains around minus 1.4. And this is not as close to zero as this one, but pretty small still quantitatively and very far from significant. What about trade, like apparel sector, textiles, furniture, toys? They are really affected by Chinese import competition. Controlling for Chinese import competition, again, as theory suggests, this doesn't change much. And, you know, my own work, as well as, you know, my own work joint with David Otter and Gordon Hanson, as well as, and David Dorn, as well as David Dorn, David Otter, and Gordon Hanson's own work on which we built, shows Chinese competition has been very important for employment in local labor markets and more broadly, but actually its explanatory power for wage inequality is very limited. And in fact, that's actually consistent with theory, because things that affect the final goods will only work through these terms here. So let me go back. These industry shifters. The industry shifters matter. So it's not that the industry shifters don't matter, and some of this is due to trade. But once you control for industry shifters, theory actually says trade shouldn't matter for inequality. And in fact, that's exactly what we find. This one's more of a surprise. I would have expected the unionization to matter. And we have more detailed work looking at rents and rent sharing and tasks and technology. There are different ways of looking at it, but at this level, unionization doesn't seem to matter either. And then finally, markups would matter a lot, potentially, because they affect labor share directly and they affect labor demand. And we do a lot of different things with markups and concentration, and none of that changes the task displacement, and none of this has a much of an effect on anything. We do a lot more work in the paper, looking at offshoring, for example, which also matters, much less than automation, but with the same coefficient, which is again what theory implies. The results are similar in sub-periods. We do stuff at the regional level. So local variation gives very similar results, which is very reassuring. But in my last remaining 5 minutes, let me surge ahead and talk about the quantitative exercise. I want to just give a very quick overview. This is a more complicated part of the paper. So even if I had half an hour, it wouldn't be completely illuminating, because there's an element of, here is something I prepared at home and showing you. But I want to first explain why you need a new methodology for thinking about general equilibrium. Well, if you have a task-based model, it's a very high dimensional fixed point problem. You're finding these boundaries. So everything, wages depend on these task shares at the industry level, but the task shares themselves depend on wages because they're cost minimizing. So for example, if you have 500 demographic groups and 50 industries, that's going to be a 2,500 dimensional fixed point problem. And the inputs into that will be these very complex functions. So that's not very tractable. But we start with a very simple observation. If you take a simple shock, whatever shock it is, for us it's automation, but any shock, Z, that's going to affect wages. That's the direct effect. But then wages themselves are going to have, through an implicit function theorem reasoning, are going to affect these task shares. Because remember, task shares are cost minimizing. So that's what this D is, and everything is vector notation. But then when you collect terms here, the wage comes here as a shifter and is the outcome here, then you can write that in the usual way that some of you will have seen in input-output networks in the Leontief matrix. The wage change due to a vector of technologies is going to be something that looks like the Leontief inverse, which we're going to call the propagation matrix, which encodes all elasticities of substitution between different factors. So these very high dimensional comparative advantage schedules go all into there. And the entries of this turns out to be sufficient to know all the general equilibrium effects. In particular, now let me just focus on automation, one type of technology. If I want to know what happens to group G from automation, without ripple effects, without the GE, all I need to know is that group's task displacement. But in GE, what I need to know is the task displacement of all groups filtered through the relevant row of the propagation matrix. So once I know the propagation matrix, I have everything I need to know. The rest, prices, etc., can also be computed in the same way. So this is the equation that I want to estimate. Now, these terms I can compute directly. This is the productivity effect. This is the automation measure that we used in the reduced form evidence. These are the industry shifts, again, we used. I just don't have the propagation matrix. If I had that, I could compute everything else. But now, I'm going to argue we can actually estimate the propagation matrix. If we do indeed have exogenous shocks, then we can trace those exogenous shocks that affect, say, Gözde's group, on my group, on Erinç's group, etc., and that would be the propagation matrix. But of course, the propagation matrix is still too high dimensional. It's 500 by 500. So you need to do a dimension reduction. So fortunately, theory tells you a lot of symmetry conditions on it because it has a reasoning similar to the Slutsky matrix. And moreover, we can also parameterize it as a function of distance between different groups. So we do it as a sigmoid function between occupational, industry, education, and age group differences across industries. And then that gives you a bunch of moment conditions, and then you can do GMM using shocks. All right, that's what we do. I'm not going to show you that. The estimates are in the paper. And I'm going to just conclude by showing you what you get out of this. And this figure is what you get out of it. This is the productivity effect. Now I can, in a GE, know exactly what the productivity effect. You see this very, very uniform across all groups, as it should be. And it's very large, 40 log points. So if there was nothing else, everybody would have increased their earnings quite a bit. What about industry shifts? Well, industry shifts now start creating a little bit of variation. Some groups like us, we are in industries like health, education, management, consulting, etc., that have enjoyed increases in value-added shares. So that would have created a little bit of wage inequality, but not that much. Now add to it the direct effects of task displacement. Now that's huge. It's actually larger than before because regression actually dampened them a little bit. And why did regression dampen them? Because actually the regression, ignoring ripple effects, they were going into the error term, was looking at something that is more compressed than the direct effects of task displacement. And in fact, when you add the ripple effects, that has a democratizing impact on inequality, precisely because these groups that were suffering a lot of task displacement are now competing, but then they're pulling down a lot of other groups. So these groups here, these are middle education groups, especially women. Now look at them, they are actually suffering wage declines. So that's democratizing in a way, but in a bad way. The men who are experiencing task displacement are pulling down some of the women as well. When you put everything together with the GE, task displacement again explains about 50% of the wage changes. It's a bit different than the 50% in reduced form, but it's it turns out to be more or less the same. And then the final thing, and this goes back to Gözde's question as well, all of this happens while automation accounts for just 4% of an increase in TFP. In the data, TFP increases by 80% during this time period. So automation has tiny effects on TFP. In fact, wages increase a lot. Part of it is because of compositional changes that Gözde mentioned. So mean wages increase because there's educational upgrading. But a lot of this is because there are other types of technologies that are pushing up GDT, that are pushing up TFP. But interestingly, they don't have much distributional effects. So those other types of technologies, they help a little bit more the postgraduate workers and women, but their distributional effects are very small. So therefore, one final thing I'm going to repeat. If you believe what I'm showing you, one quick summary is you really need to think about different types of technologies doing different things. Everything is more nuanced, but if you want to think of two big buckets, automation technologies, small TFP gains, big distributional effects. Other types of technologies that increase productivity, small distributional effects, big TFP gains. That, of course, then raises lots of issues for future work. Are we doing too much automation? Huge distributional effects, little gain? Well, those are all questions we can talk about, but I'll stop here, and I welcome your comments, questions, criticisms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daron Hocam. The floor is now open for questions.
Let me share. Yes.
Great. So you can either type your question on the chat screen if you would like me to read it out loud, or you can raise your hand so that we can unmute you and you can ask your question directly.
Yeah, I encourage people asking their own questions. It's more personal, even though it's on Zoom.
In that case, I'd like to exploit my status as the host and ask another question.
Please do.
I'm wondering about the ripple effects across industries, because I think what you estimate are the ripple effects within the industry of different demographic groups that start competing for non-automated tasks, right? But
absolutely.
There are certainly comparable tasks across different industries as well. So could we be observing in the data also, let's say, males from a certain demographic group are replacing the women in the same demographic group doing comparable tasks, but in a different industry?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. So, there are two things going on here. One is that whenever you have a shock, it's going to change value-added shares because it's changing relative prices. So in both the empirical work and the theory, those are controlled for by those value-added shares. So that's one of some set of effects are going to work in there. So in some of the numbers I gave you, I already factored those in. In some of them, in the reduced form numbers, I didn't. But then the second thing is that when I talk of ripple effects, they're really a very complicated, complex object. For instance, some ripple effects will be that, my demographic group gets displaced, and then I take away some tasks from Erinç, but then Erinç takes away some tasks from Damla, and he's as good as those tasks as Damla was, so he doesn't suffer that much. And as a result, then Damla goes and takes away tasks from Sondan. That's very, very high dimensional. So we're actually bypassing that. So that propagation matrix at the end says, I don't know what's going on in all of these intermediate steps. All I want to know is how much the marginal product of Sondan's group is experiencing. And that's exactly what we estimate in the data, and that's what we go down to. So, but there's an interesting question there, which we haven't looked at and could be looked at. Do we also see quantities moving along the lines of the propagation matrix? So for our GE exercise, we didn't need to do that, but you may want to do that for validation, and it might be a more complex picture than the first one that might come to your mind, which my language may have inadvertently suggested, like men go and directly compete for women. It may not be that way. Men go and compete for other men, and then those men then drop out or change other things, and then ultimately there is a negative effect on women. So we're sort of black boxing that a little bit into that propagation matrix.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that question.
There's a question on the chat screen. Unfortunately, I will have to read it because because Hulusi is not available, is in a library. So that's the only solution, apparently. I remember Professor Michael Sandel from Harvard making a distinction between skilled and essential workers. Actually, our minds are still fresh with the fact that carriers, truck drivers, factory workers, farmers have become so essential, especially during the pandemic. Similarly, UK currently suffers from the lack of truck drivers and farm workers. Does Professor Acemoğlu think that there will be transformational force in wage plannings in favor of unskilled but essential workers, even though the reign of automation is inevitable?
It's a great question. I'm a huge fan of Michael Sandel's work, and it actually has interesting intersections in terms of the more philosophical aspects of what technology is doing. But in a competitive labor market, the distinction between essential and skill is very difficult to conceptualize. Because if you are essential, meaning that there are some tasks that are critical, and you're the only one who's performing it, then you should get compensated for it. So the only way that in a competitive market, your wages will be low is because you are performing tasks for which you are very substitutable with either machines or other types of labor. However, once we go beyond competitive labor markets, and that's some of the work that Pasquale and I are doing right now, then you can have this distinction, because it might well be that, my demographic group is doing some very important tasks and no other demographic group would like to do it at this price, for example. So that would be for workers who are doing drug delivery or working in hospitality, food preparation during COVID. But because of bargaining, those workers' wages are pushed below the wages relative to their marginal product. They are pushed below what, say, more educated workers would be receiving relative to their own marginal product. So that bargaining or rent sharing differences would be one way of conceptualizing that. But beyond that, I can't say more on that question today.
Oktay, you can go ahead.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for organizer. We are really lucky to see here, Professor. So I have two questions as a student, first of all. So you analyze the effect of automation on hourly wages, then income inequality, etc. So, for example, there is also literature on the, for example, there's also literature on the other side. For example, what if causality in the other direction, from wages to automation? So in this literature, especially in the post-Keynesian economics, wage pressure plays an important role. If wage pressure is high, so entrepreneurs try to think, how can I automate this task? So this is first question. The second one is for example, there is also automation of the task in the advanced technologies. For example, Oracle and Amazon Web Services, these are advanced technology suppliers. These companies provides also automation of tasks for machine learning engineer, for example, a data scientist task, for example. So in your model, you say that the routine jobs can be automated, but the question is this: how can we apply your model in the automation of tasks in the advanced technology that the skilled laborers work for? Thank you.
Thank you, Oktay. Those are both great questions. The first one is especially very important, and I'll come back to that. But let me start with the second one, which is easier. I think, first of all, with AI, there will be automation in parts that perhaps we are not thinking about right now. Although my own work, I have a paper on AI that's coming out in the Journal of Labor Economics, which finds that still a lot of AI-based automation is still for low and middle skill jobs. But the future may be different. I think for things like Amazon Web Services or the current data applications, I think they are advanced technologies, but I wouldn't see them as automation technologies. They're not really actually replacing the things that very skilled designers or managers are doing, but they are, in terms of my model, what would be is that they are enabling them to expand into tasks that other workers used to do. So I have not emphasized that, but imagine like what word processing software in PCs have done in the 1980s. It's not that they completely automated typing. It's what they enabled is like that managers who used to have their typing done by assistants or secretaries, now they do their own typing. So they have actually expanded the set of tasks that managers do at the expense of lower skill workers. So it's automation, but the automation is using labor, and the burden is not on the groups that are more skilled, but there are more unskilled. Now, in terms of your first question, that's absolutely right. And you've noticed something very important, which I skipped. So actually, assumption one, which I said it kills the ripple effects, it actually does two things in the paper. And I just glossed over that because of time pressure. It says, A, there are no ripple effects, and B, there is no marginal automation. So what that means is that I'm also assuming that changes in prices at the margin does not induce differential automation. And that's a very big assumption, but it's consistent with my focus in this paper that I want to look at exogenous changes in automation, like the robotics technology at the frontier, what it's doing. But this is not to say that the other side is uninteresting. And in fact, two of my, I said this is part of a research program, two of my papers so far have focused on exactly that. And then the work, and then the two sides meet, especially in the presence of labor market imperfections in the new work that we are doing. So let me say, at the expense of indulging the rest and explaining more of my work. So essentially, there are two dimensions in which your very well-placed question is relevant. One is, once a technology exists, how quickly it is adopted, one automation technology exists, how quickly or how widely it is adopted will depend on prices. So higher wages, this automation framework is exactly predicting that. The more expensive is labor, the more automation technologies will be adopted. And we have another paper with Pasquale looking at demographics, aging especially, which changes the availability of worker and wages, of especially blue-collar workers. And what we show is that actually about 40% of changes in robot adoption around the world is exactly through that channel, that the cost pressures are very different in places like Germany, South Korea, Japan, for instance, compared to the UK or the US, and certainly countries like Turkey, which are not aging and facing similar type of labor shortages. I think that's very important. And again, it should be, for a more holistic thing, it should be put together. The second is actually the technological change development. So the paper, the first paper we published, or not quite the first paper, but the first major paper we published on this, which is in the American Economic Review a number of years ago, has the speed of automation technologies as well as new tasks endogenous, and how quickly you invest in automation technologies is dependent on a process such as the one that you are emphasizing. So in particular, if labor share declines, automation technologies slow down, and if labor share increases, automation technologies pick up speed, and that could or may not be an equilibrating force. It will depend. It will not be an efficiently equilibrating force, but it might be an equilibrating force for long-run stability. So those are very, very important points. So thanks for raising them.
Okay, Emre, I think you can go ahead.
Thank you, Hocam. I have a question as a MA student. My question is about the labor dispute and automation or robotization. You have already checked the deunionization part, but I want to search a channel with deunionization and or trade union density. Maybe is there any, what do you think about what is the role of the low unionization or trade union density to make a faster, more automation and robotization? It is the main topic of my MA thesis. Thank you.
I see. Great. Yeah, no, I think, as I said, I did find it surprising of the, my prior, so this just doesn't really matter too much, but we, Pasquale and I, have been working on this for quite a while. So we sort of hypothesized all of these things before looking at the data, and the specific sort of patterns that we found in the data. The strength of them were a bit surprising, but in fact, a lot of the things were consistent with our theoretical expectations. So the fact that, for example, trade shouldn't matter much and different types of capital deepening shouldn't matter once you control for automation. The one that I was expecting to be much more important was the unionization. And I think the reason for that is, first of all, the unionization happens a lot in the US in the same industries that are also undergoing automation. So, and second, the unionization is probably too crude. A lot of bargaining, rent sharing is much more at a micro level. And then third, there are other technologies such as monitoring technologies that are intersecting with rent sharing. For instance, what you are seeing in Amazon warehouses is a lot of heavy monitoring that reduces wages relative to what they would have to pay for a very speedy, very fast rate of work. So there are some very interesting issues, I think, related to non-competitive labor markets, rents, and automation. So if you are working on those, that's a fantastic topic. And Pasquale and I are also doing some both theoretical and empirical work on that. So I don't think the deunionization results here are by any chance the final word. Now, again, this relates to Oktay's question. There is also, the sort of the demographic effects that I mentioned work through wages. But there's also a new paper that's just come out by David Hemus and Morten Olsen that looks at the relationship between wages and automation, which does include some of the rent effects, and they find sort of similar things. And then there is also some correlational evidence that unionization across countries seems to matter for automation, although it's very crude. So I wouldn't, know how much weight to put on that.
Can I do a quick follow-up on Emre's question?
Please, yes.
Yeah. Also, the US is more of a special case, well, at least compared to the European countries in terms of unionization, right? So I believe the results would be, I would expect the results to be different, perhaps, for European countries if we did a similar exercise.
Yep,
right?
I absolutely. So, there have now been a couple of, so some of the, again, intermediate papers that Pasquale and I have written have looked at automation and labor share changes without the distributional effects, but just capital over labor. And a number of papers have now extended that to European countries, and you see kind of similar trends there. But how that translates into inequality across labor groups, especially, will depend on, say, how much rent sharing there is and how much protection for low-wage workers there is and other things. So I expect those to be different, as well as the employment effects.
Thank you. So there's a question from Aslı. Aslı Hocam, I think you can unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, first of all, for this open-minded talk. I have a question on the model, task-based approach. That, as I understood right, that this model is mostly on the division of jobs. I mean, when we think about the service sector that covers the most of the workforce, what actually can the task-based approach be adapted on this service sector where the jobs are less divisible? I mean,
yeah, I think, thank you, Aslı. That's a good question. I mean, I think the proof of the pudding will have to be the eating. But if you look at service sector jobs, they are also bundles of tasks. Now, there might be some greater complementarities in some instances that some tasks may be harder to divide. But, one famous example which shows the flexibility of those tasks is bank tellers. Bank tellers used to do one of the major tasks that they used to do is check your accounts and dispense cash. Now those tasks have been completely automated, and bank tellers' occupations have completely changed. So I don't think it's any different for other service occupations, but in some cases, actually, technology will have to also play a role in reshaping the task. Like, for example, if you look at driving, it's a bundle of tasks. But right now, we have no way of separating those tasks because you just need a long haul driver who's going to do both the long haul driving and the carrying and the short haul driving and the in-city driving as well as the highway driving. But with automated vehicles, depending on how the technology goes, some of those tasks could be separated. So I think those are, I don't think conceptually, there are some issues about, divisibility of tasks that I think will apply to manufacturing as well. I think there's some interesting issues there. It turns out to be, those models are much, much harder because price theory doesn't quite apply when you have some of those, depending on how you put the task indivisibilities in there. So it makes things much more complicated. But once you leave those issues aside, or once you handle those issues, the rest is empirical about like both service and non-manufacturing sectors.
I'll just read a question from the chat screen from another participant who was not able to unmute themselves. And then Erinç Hocam, I'll give the floor to you. So Barış is asking, what are the impacts or what are the implications for the Turkish economy? Whether you have any hypothesis?
Great question. I don't know. I think overall automation, especially like Aslı said, automation in the non-manufacturing industries are already remaking the international division of labor. So we see a pattern of reshoring. We're seeing things that would have migrated to other countries already not doing so. And as a result, I think they're going to have fairly major effects on developing countries, depending on which part of the value chain they are in. But there has been very little study of this. I've tried to look at that both with cross-country data and the Turkish data. Haven't made much progress yet. If you look at Turkish education numbers or education premia, there are some really puzzling features. This might be data quality or maybe because of compositional effects. So that sort of stopped me into my tracks there. But with cross-country data, there's some interesting patterns and Turkey seems to fit there, but much more work is needed. So it's a good topic to study.
Erinç Hocam.
I have a question on the gender implications. I read and listened to quite a line of thinking from our mostly women's studies and gender studies colleagues, which roughly goes like this: that automation typically displaces routine tasks, and routine tasks are typically the jobs of women, especially young, relatively less skilled, relatively less educated, and therefore the gender bias of automation is typically against the women of unskilled labor, replacing their routine occupations, routine tasks. From your study, I understand that you typically phrased your comments or findings in terms of men displacing, being displaced, and then crowding out the women's job markets. Can you elaborate on this?
Sure. That's an excellent question. Thank you, Erinç. That's an excellent question. First of all, that's absolutely right. Women, low education women also suffer displacement. But on the whole, during this period, less than men. And the reason for that is because, if you look at the specialization of low education women, it's actually across many sectors that are undergoing very slow automation. They're not great jobs, but food preparation, fast food, home care, those are not undergoing any automation. Actually, it's the middle education women in office jobs that suffered some automation. But because women are very underrepresented in blue-collar jobs, and blue-collar jobs were among the chief sufferers of automation, so to speak, during this period, overall, the burden of automation has been less on them than on men. But, Erinç, you are absolutely right. It's not a law of nature by any stretch of imagination. So if you look at a previous round of big automation in the US, one very important one, there's a very nice paper that's just come out on that, is on telephone operators, for example. That was completely women. So telephone automatic switches at one fell swoop got rid of about 500,000 low education, very young women. So there are going to be other things that are going to affect women And with the next phase, it's not clear. But so far, at least my empirical work here and my overall reading of the data is that women have often been more indirectly affected. Well, they've been both directly but indirectly, but the indirect effects are very interesting. That essentially men have started competing against them in jobs that they would not have competed against. They would not have attempted before. But overall, you know, women's job market has also improved autonomously in the US. So that, you know, the gender gap has closed quite a bit during this period.
Gözde, may I go ahead?
Please, Ulaş.
I have a question. A substantial part of your work is on institutions. I'm just wondering what you think of the implications of the automation as far as the institutions are concerned, and as far as the institutional change is concerned in the future.
Well,
in particular, I mean, asking this question, I just remember the whole, you know, the literature and the stories of the Industrial Revolution and the political change and institutional change in the 19th century. That was probably, you know, a result of the kind of the technological change that happened during the Industrial Revolution. Now we are going through something else, another one. And as far as at least as far as the democracy is concerned, the labor working classes are becoming a bit more skilled, more creative, partly as a response to all this, you know, the automation and the new technologies. And what do you make of all this?
Well, thank you very much, Ulaş. That's a very good question, and it's actually something I'm thinking and working on. I think you know, requires at least another 2 hours to get into the details. But since automation is creating such distributional effects and also is a bundle of technologies that are affecting other forms of democratic participation, communication, and so on, monitoring, I think it has huge implications for democratic governance and needs to be analyzed within that context as well. That's part of some of the ongoing work I have, but it's also very difficult because it's a bit hard to shed light on that empirically. So some of it is based on, you know, less detailed empirical work, but it is a very important set of issues. In one sentence, I am super worried that automation, making workers less essential and therefore reducing both labor market opportunities, but also political and organizational participation is really having a foundational threat against democracy as we know it. And whether democratic institutions adapt to it or whether we have other institutional solutions to reduce the amount of automation, especially in marginal cases, those are questions that remain to be answered. Thank you.
Thanks.
Damla has a question next.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much. It is an honor for me to be here. And it will be a complementary question to Erinç Hoca. You talked about ripple effect, and it is fascinating for me. I need to check it afterwards. I need to read your writings more in detail, but about its effects, it will be great for somebody because they won't stay as jobless, but it will be bad for somebody because their jobs will be taken by them. So I'm interested in your idea. What do you think about this issue? What can you say? What can we do? I mean, those people that being jobless, those people that getting their jobs, those people that's giving those jobs, or those people that taking decisions. So what is your idea?
Thank you, Damla. I think that's a great question. And let me give it two-layered answer. First of all, I don't know. I think there's much more to be done there. And the reason why I'm saying I don't know is because if you take a competitive labor market as both an empirical description and as a normative description, then actually ripple effects are good. Why? Because ripple effects smooth out. Without the ripple effects, you have much bigger increases in inequality and they fall on the shoulders of some demographic groups. So the ripple effects enable those demographic groups to share. It's like an insurance mechanism. That's why I called democratizing. But if the labor market is non-competitive, for example, women were already discriminated against, then this could actually exacerbate some of those problems. So it would really depend on the nature of labor market imperfections. And so that's the sense in which it requires more study, more in-depth study. Thank you for the question.
Great. I think we have already surpassed the time limit thanks to a very, very lively Q&A session. Daron Hocam, once again, thank you so much for joining today. It was, I think, very illuminating, and at least for me, I already got 2 different ideas for new research during your seminar. Very productive, very lively. So thank you first and foremost to you and for everyone who joined, and hope to have you in person for the next one.
Thank you, Gözde. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks everybody for coming and engaging with the talk. And indeed, next time, hopefully in person.
Great. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening or a good afternoon. Bye. Aleyna, oturum kapatabiliriz. Çok teşekkürler.
İyi günler. Görüşmek üzere.
İyi günler hocam. Görüşmek üzere. Teşekkürler.